He rode toward the edge of eternity with fingers already gone, eaten away by a disease that would not stop until it claimed his life. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, just 21 years old, could barely curl his ruined hands around the hilt of his sword. Silk wrappings hid what leprosy had done to him, but nothing could hide the truth. The man who would command this army was dying. Before him, the land shimmered under a scorching Levantine sun in the summer of 1182. Arrayed on the horizon, like a living wall of steel and dust, stood some 30,000 of Islam's finest warriors under the legendary Saladin. Facing them, on the Crusader side, were only 750 knights and about 4,000 infantry. A force so small that Saladin's scouts reportedly laughed when they counted them, a 40-to-1 disadvantage. By every rule of medieval warfare, this was suicide. Yet by sunset, 2,000 Muslim warriors would lie dead, while the tiny Crusader host remained intact. Historians have wrestled with this paradox ever since. How did they survive? What new tactics were born on that field? And why did this impossible victory help doom the kingdom it seemed to save? To understand how this moment came to the brink of catastrophe, the story rewinds 2 years, to 1180, when the Holy Land exhaled after decades of bloodshed. A fragile truce stretched between the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's rising Ayyubid Empire. A 2-year pause that allowed both sides to lick their wounds and rebuild. In Jerusalem, Baldwin IV ruled from stone halls he could barely walk through. A teenage king whose mind moved like a seasoned general while his body collapsed cell by cell. He had already shown flashes of brilliance on the battlefield, yet every victory cost him more of himself. Across the desert and mountains stood Saladin, the merciful conqueror, who had forged Syria and Egypt into a single disciplined war machine. Where earlier Muslim rulers quarreled and fractured, he unified and focused, his gaze locked on Jerusalem. On the surface, the ceasefire looked like a blessing, a respite granted by God. In reality, it was a powder keg disguised as peace, with trade, pride, and ambition piling up like tinder, waiting for one reckless spark. The spark came from a man who seemed to crave disaster. Reynold de Chatillon, lord of the fortress at Kerak, sat astride the vital trade artery between Damascus and Egypt and treated it like his personal hunting ground. Truce or no truce, he watched the caravans pass beneath his walls, long processions of camels, merchants, pilgrims, and saw not sacred journeys, but rivers of gold. In late 1181, he made the choice that would set the Levant on fire. Reynold's men swept down from Kerak and ambushed a massive caravan bound from Damascus to Mecca, cutting through guards, seizing goods, dragging captives back to his fortress. Among the travelers was Saladin's own sister. The loot was staggering, worth some 200,000 dinars. When Saladin demanded restitution and the release of prisoners, Reynold reportedly laughed off the Sultan's fury with a taunt that echoed through the Muslim world. Let your Muhammad come and save them. It was more than piracy. It was a personal insult wrapped in blasphemy, delivered to a ruler who now had every moral and political reason to answer with steel. What followed would not be a minor border skirmish. Reynold's greed had given Saladin the perfect justification to turn a tense peace into holy war. Saladin answered the insult not with a single sword, but with an empire. From Cairo's mosques to the citadels of Syria, his call for jihad rolled like thunder, summoning warriors who believed they were marching toward both glory and paradise. By May 1182, the mustering ground at Damascus had transformed into a living sea of men and horses around 30,000 strong. There were 12,000 mounted archers, Turks and Kurds whose arrows could whistle from the string at full gallop, and 8,000 regular cavalry armed with lances and curved blades. Behind them tramped infantry, engineers hauling siege gear, and waves of volunteers eager to win salvation with a sword stroke. To grasp the scale, imagine a column of men and animals stretching miles across the burning earth, their dust cloud visible from 20 miles away, their daily food enough to feed a city. This was not just an army. It was a mobile civilization on campaign, held together by discipline and Saladin's will. Across the line, the Kingdom of Jerusalem could barely gather 1,200 knights in total, most of them scattered in distant castles. Against this rising storm, the Crusader realm looked less like a kingdom and more like a thin, cracking shell. As Saladin's hosts gathered like a storm front, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced a choice that should never have existed. Its power lay in stone fortresses scattered from the green hills of Lebanon to the baking shores of the Red Sea. Each castle had its own garrison, its own small reserve of knights and men-at-arms, enough to repel raiders but not a full-scale invasion. The very system that had allowed the Crusader states to survive for decades now became their greatest weakness. They were strong everywhere and nowhere at once. In Jerusalem's halls, Baldwin IV studied the reports with a body that betrayed him and a mind that refused to surrender. He could watch Saladin's 30,000 tear his kingdom apart piece by piece, or he could do the unthinkable. He chose the unthinkable. Baldwin ordered garrisons stripped to the bone, leaving bare minimum defenders in the castles and concentrating every available knight and infantryman into a single field army, around 750 knights and 4,000 foot. Raymond III of Tripoli, the kingdom's most seasoned commander, argued bitterly against it, warning that if this one force was destroyed, there would be nothing left. Baldwin listened, then overruled him. For a dying king, it was a final wager. Risk everything in one battle, or lose everything without one. The place where Baldwin chose to make his stand was not a city or a shrine, but a fortress of black stone overlooking a scar of earth. Belvoir Castle, perched high above the Jordan Valley, commanded the main artery between Damascus and Jerusalem like a watchful, unblinking eye. Its walls rose more than 500 feet above the plains, a tiered citadel of limestone and basalt that seemed fused to the rock itself. Saladin could not simply walk past it. To leave Belvoir uncowed at his back would be to march with a knife hovering at his throat, his supply lines exposed to Crusader raids. So he chose a different kind of attack. Muslim cavalry flooded into the valley, not to storm the fortress, but to burn everything beneath its gaze. From Belvoir's ramparts, Crusader eyes watched as riders swept through the patchwork of farms and villages, torches held high. One by one, fields ignited. Roofs collapsed in sudden pillars of flame. In 3 days, some 60 villages were reduced to blackened foundations and drifting ash. Women, children, and old men staggered up the slopes toward the castle, clutching what little they could carry. The kingdom's tax base for the coming year went up in smoke before their eyes. Belvoir was no longer just a fortress. It was a balcony above the birth of economic warfare. While smoke from the burning villages smeared the horizon, something unprecedented unfolded in the shadow of Belvoir's walls. On the rocky ground below the fortress, Baldwin's stripped-down army drilled with a precision no chronicler had seen in a Crusader host. Infantry and cavalry did not stand apart in loose clusters of feudal banners. They moved together, piece by piece, like components of a machine being assembled under fire. Pikemen practiced locking their 14-foot spears into a bristling wall, angling the shafts to catch charging horses at the chest. Between their ranks, crossbowmen stepped in and out of narrow gaps, raising and lowering heavy bows, rehearsing volleys on command. Behind this living barrier, knights in full mail sat their war horses, not as a reckless vanguard but as a coiled fist, waiting for specific horn calls that would open lanes in the infantry line for short, brutal countercharges. Latin chroniclers would later call this integrated formation something like a hedgehog of ditches and iron, the iron hedgehog. Whether it sprang from careful planning or desperate improvisation, no one can say. What is certain is that in those days, beneath Belvoir, a dying king's army quietly rewrote the rules of how foot and horse could fight as one. At Belvoir, the morning of battle rose beautiful and merciless. First light spilled over the Jordan Valley, painting the castle's stone in molten gold while the plains below lay veiled in a faint haze of dust. From the fortress heights, Baldwin's small army began its descent in a slow, deliberate tide of steel. There was no wild rush of banners, no vanguard of hot-blooded knights lunging ahead. Instead, Saladin's scouts watched something that violated every expectation they held of Frankish warfare. A single, compact formation moving as one, an armored creature with a pike-bristling hide and a heart of mounted knights. The 4,000 infantry formed a solid shell, spear points jutting outward in all directions, with crossbowmen nested in the spaces between. Inside that shell, 750 knights and their war horses advanced in measured rhythm, kept on a tight leash of discipline. When the first wave of Turkish mounted archers swept into range, hooves drumming on hard earth, the sky suddenly blackened, with arrows thousands of shafts hissing downward. On command, shields snapped up in a seamless ripple, overlapping like scales. The iron hedgehog did not flinch, did not scatter. Under a storm that had shattered armies before, it simply kept moving. The mounted archers' first storm of arrows was only the opening breath. From Saladin's side, a new sound rolled across the field, a deeper, heavier thunder, as 500 Mamluk heavy cavalry formed into a dense wedge. These were the elite, men whose charge had shattered Christian lines from Spain to Syria. At the signal, they lowered their lances and drove forward, a wall of muscle and iron pounding straight toward the Crusader front. The impact, when it came, was like a hammer hitting a shield. The pike walls shuddered, spears snapped, men were hurled backward, horses screamed and reared as sharpened ash wood bit into their chests. For a heartbeat, the iron hedgehog seemed to fold, its front ranks bowing inward as if about to break. But the bend stopped short of collapse. Officers shouted, ranks locked, shields overlapped tighter, and the formation absorbed the shock instead of shattering. As the Mamluks tried to peel away and regroup, crossbowmen stepped into the gaps and loosed at point-blank range. Bolts tore through mail and into unprotected joints, dropping armored riders in the space of a few breaths. In that chaos, Baldwin's body finally betrayed him. He slumped in the saddle and slid, caught by his guards before he hit the ground. Laid on a litter, pale and shaking, he still forced his voice out through clenched teeth, ordering one thing above all: hold the line. When brute force failed, the battlefield shifted into a contest of nerves. Turkish commanders reached for the weapon that had broken so many Frankish hosts before, the feigned retreat. A fresh wave of some 500 light cavalry spurred forward, loosing arrows, skimming along the edge of the pike wall. Then, at a shouted signal, they wheeled and fled in a choreographed panic, dust boiling behind them. It was a perfect invitation, an enemy, apparently en route, backs exposed, begging to be ridden down. In any other age, young knights would have answered with lowered lances and spurred heels, chasing glory into the trap. For long moments, the Crusader line trembled on that knife edge. Men panted behind their visors, horses tossed their heads, and through the slits of the formation, fleeing riders looked impossibly vulnerable. Raymond of Tripoli and other captains shouted themselves hoarse, reminding their men what would happen if they broke ranks. The iron hedgehog held. Not one knight bolted from the protective shell. Again and again, light cavalry repeated the maneuver: charge, clash, retreat, tempt. Again and again, the formation answered not with pursuit, but with a flat, disciplined refusal. On that dusty plain, the Turks discovered something terrifying: an enemy who had learned to chain its own instincts. With the feigned retreat spent and the enemy still unbroken, Baldwin turned caution into cold aggression. From his litter, he gave the order that stunned both armies. The formation would not stand still, it would advance. Slowly, methodically, the iron hedgehog began to roll forward across the plain, armor glinting in the rising sun. Every step was a drumbeat, 4,000 infantry boots grinding dust under heel, pike shafts swaying in a steel forest, horses moving in lockstep behind the living wall. To the watching Muslims, it was like seeing a fortress uproot itself in march. The psychological shock rippled through Saladin's ranks. They had expected charging knights or a static shield wall, not this relentless, creeping pressure. Saladin understood the danger. If this steel-clad block pushed far enough, it could punch a hole through his carefully arranged lines and threaten his command position itself. He chose to answer overwhelming discipline with overwhelming force. Signals flashed along the Muslim host, drums pounded, and banners dipped. 8,000 cavalry began to form in layered waves, heavy and light horse side by side. When they surged forward, the ground quaked, dust exploding upward as a tidal wall of riders crashed down toward the advancing fortress of men. The collision hit like an earthquake. Thousands of hooves slammed into the earth as Saladin's cavalry folded around the advancing block of men, burying it in dust and noise. The iron hedgehog disappeared inside a storm of horses and steel. Then its secret appeared. Instead of shattering, the front ranks bent backward, while the flanks swung inward like hinges. Riders who thought they were punching through found themselves squeezed into narrow channels, pressed against pikes they could not outrun. From three sides, crossbow bolts smashed into the packed masses at near point-blank range. In barely 20 minutes, hundreds of riders lay dead at the formation's feet, their mounts piled in heaps along the pike line. Saladin shifted tactics, driving infantry and dismounted nobles against the edges, trying to claw open a gap. When that failed, he turned the sky into a weapon. 12,000 mounted archers began to wheel around the formation, loosing until the light dimmed in a steel rain of arrows. Shields bristled like porcupines, yet Pavese barriers inside the ranks let wounded be dragged to cover and crossbowmen reload. Under a storm that should have ended it, the iron hedgehog bled, staggered, and kept advancing. At last, numbers forced their way through the dust and noise. Messengers rode to Saladin's command hill with casualty reports that made no sense for a battle his men should have owned. Around 2,000 of his warriors already lay dead. Mamluks, regular cavalry, eager volunteers against fewer than 200 Crusaders. The arithmetic was brutal. Every elite rider who fell represented years of training and a web of loyalties. To kill 750 knights and a few thousand infantry at this rate, he might have to sacrifice 10,000 men. Saladin's eyes swept the field. The iron hedgehog still creeped forward, slower now. Shields ragged, banners torn, yet its shape unbroken. His emirs demanded one more massive charge, one last effort to finish the exhausted enemy. Instead, he made the call that set him apart from lesser commanders. He ordered the withdrawal. Horns signaled measured retreat, not rout. Cavalry peeled away in layers, still loosing arrows to discourage pursuit. Infantry formed rearguards, shielding the baggage train as it pulled back. On the other side, Crusaders watched their tormentors fade like a receding tide. They did not cheer. They couldn't. Men sank to their knees where they stood, leaning on blood-slicked pikes, horses lathered and trembling. They had survived the impossible, but every breath tasted of dust, sweat, and the knowledge that the enemy still outnumbered them many times over. When the sun finally lowered over Belvoir, the scale of what had happened lay written on the ground. The field below the castle was carpeted with bodies and broken horses, armor twisted and banners trampled into mud streaked with drying blood. Around 2,000 Muslim dead marked the path of the Iron Hedgehog's advance. On the Crusader side, roughly 180 lay still, and some 400 more groaned among the wounded. By medieval standards, the casualty ratio bordered on myth, the kind of lopsided victory usually born from imagination, not eyewitness accounts. Yet even as priests moved among the fallen and surgeons worked by fading light, another reality emerged, one not measured in corpses, but in ashes. There were no lines of captured emirs to ransom, no train of noble prisoners whose freedom could refill royal coffers. The battle had been too close, too savage, for surrender. Most who fell on either side died where they stood, and far beyond the blood-soaked plain, the invisible bill came due. Those 60 villages burned in the days before the clash, their fields destroyed, their people scattered. The kingdom had saved its army at Belvoir, but its harvest, its tax base, its future coin were already gone, drifting skyward in black smoke. In the quiet after battle, Belvoir's true meaning stretched far beyond the corpses at its foot. On that blistering day, the Iron Hedgehog had proven itself a tactical marvel. Pike walls, integrated crossbow fire, and controlled nightly countercharges woven into a single living engine of war, centuries ahead of its time. Yet it was also a weapon the Crusader states could barely afford to field. Such discipline, such equipment, such training demanded an economy and manpower they did not truly possess. Saladin, watching his army pull back, had learned the lesson that mattered most. He did not need to smash the hedgehog head-on. He simply had to starve it. In the years that followed, he turned that insight into a slow, merciless strategy. Burning fields here, raiding there, forcing the kingdom to stretch thin again, until at Hattin in 1187, a Crusader army died of thirst and disarray before it died by the sword. Baldwin IV did not live to see that end. He died in 1185, his body finally surrendering to the disease that had stalked him since youth, never knowing that his greatest battlefield triumph had helped teach his enemy how to unmake his world. At Belvoir, chivalric glory met cold arithmetic, and in that collision, the kingdom of Jerusalem began to fade.